Remember those weirdest 1970s sitcoms? Too good to forget, yet somehow we did? Back then, these oddball shows lit up our living rooms with laughs, confusion, and characters we couldn't stop watching. What made us love them? And then quietly leave them behind? This was the kind of show that confused you first, then got you hooked. You would stare at the screen thinking, "What did I just watch?" And then watch another episode just to make sure it was not a dream. And if you stuck around, you were in for one of the most quietly wild rides television ever took. It was not flashy, it was not loud, it was something else entirely. Something so peculiar and offbeat that even by 1970s standards, it felt out of place. And yet, it worked. It worked in a way that made you think and laugh and sometimes sit in complete bewildered silence. Mary Hartman was not a name. It was a mantra, a chant, a warning, and a welcome all in one. Set in the fictional town of Fernwood, Ohio, it followed a housewife, Mary, who was barely hanging on to her sanity in a world that just kept piling on the absurd. The washing machine might be broken, but also there might be a mass murder in the neighborhood. The neighbors were nosy, the family was fragile, and Mary just kept trying to hold it together. The show was created by Norman Lear, the same man who brought us All in the Family and The Jeffersons. But this was his most experimental child, a satire of soap operas but also of small-town America, the media, politics, and whatever else felt relevant that week. It aired 5 nights a week, yes, 5, which meant it became part of your routine, like brushing your teeth or making coffee. Except no other part of your day ever featured this much emotional whiplash. And the performances do not even get me started. Louise Lasser, who played Mary, brought this impossible mix of blank stare and internal chaos. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but it held every emotion you could imagine. Watching her unravel, slowly and painfully, was like watching someone dance on a frozen lake. You knew something would crack, but you could not look away. This show tackled things television was not supposed to touch: mental illness, impotence, mass shootings, advertising, religion, even death cults, all with the same straight face. The humor was dry, darker than dark, and often played out in real time. You would laugh and then feel uncomfortable for laughing. That was part of the magic. But the thing that really set it apart? It was honest. In a strange way, Mary Hartman was more truthful than the news. It captured the numbness people felt during that era, the sense of trying to live a normal life while the world around you fell apart. Sound familiar? Maybe that is why it still feels so sharp today. It only ran for a year and a half, but it delivered over 300 episodes. That is not a typo. It was relentless, surreal, and utterly unlike anything before or since. And once it was gone, it left behind a silence that was hard to fill. Because love it or hate it, once you watched Mary Hartman, you never forgot it. If someone told you there was a sitcom in the 1970s about a janitor in space, you would probably laugh. Then you would ask them to prove it, and then you would sit down and watch Quark and wonder how this thing ever got made, and why no one ever talks about it, and why it is so much better than it has any right to be. Quark was created by Buck Henry, the same mind behind Get Smart. So you already knew it would be weird. But this was something else. It took place in the distant future, where a humble man named Adam Quark captains a space sanitation vessel. His job? Collect intergalactic trash. That was the entire premise. And somehow, it worked. The show parodied every science fiction trope you could think of. One week it was Star Wars, the next it was Star Trek. The sets looked like they were made out of cardboard and Christmas lights. The costumes were somewhere between Halloween store clearance and low-budget cosplay. And yet, it had heart. It had rhythm. It had just enough charm to keep you watching. Quark's crew was a beautiful mess. There was Gene and Jean, the identical clones, except one was definitely male and the other definitely female, and no one could agree on who was the original. There was Ficus, the emotionless plant-based humanoid who somehow managed to be more interesting than most humans. And then there was Betty, actually two Bettys, both played by the same actress, one of whom might have been a robot. Or maybe both. It was never entirely clear. And then there was Quark himself. Played by Richard Benjamin, he brought this everyman energy to a character who was constantly in over his head. He was not a hero. He did not want to save the galaxy. He just wanted to do his job and not get vaporized. And somehow, that made him one of the most relatable characters in all of science fiction. What made Quark truly stand out was its balance. It knew it was ridiculous. It leaned into it. But it never mocked its audience. It respected you enough to say, "Look, we know this is silly, but come along for the ride." And people did. At least the few who found it. It only lasted 8 episodes. 8. That is barely a season. But in those 8 episodes, it packed more creativity, satire, and strangely heartfelt moments than shows that ran for years. And for those who were lucky enough to see it when it aired, or who stumbled across a rerun late one night, it became one of those shows that stuck in the back of your mind. A weird little spark in a sea of static. Quark was never supposed to be a hit, and maybe that is why it is so good. It took its shot, burned bright, and vanished. But it is too good to forget. At some point in the 1970s, someone walked into a network office and said, "Let's make a buddy cop sitcom, but one of the cops is a robot." And for reasons that are both incredible and completely unclear, someone else said, "Yes, green light it." And that is how we ended up with Holmes and Yo-Yo. A show that did not just flirt with absurdity, it slow danced with it in a polyester tuxedo and steel-toed shoes. The premise alone was enough to leave audiences blinking. Detective Holmes, your average gruff, by-the-book cop, gets paired up with a new partner, Gregory Yo-Yo Yoyanovich. Except Yo-Yo is not really a person. He is an experimental android assigned to work undercover on the police force. Not exactly what you expect when you tune into ABC on a Saturday night, but somehow that made it even better. Yo-Yo looked human, sort of, talked human mostly, but everything about him was just a little off. He would accidentally take photos with his chest camera. His circuits would short out if someone sneezed too hard, and every now and then his arms would fly off, literally. You never really knew what was going to happen next, and that was part of the charm. Richard B. Schull played Holmes with a level of exasperation that should be studied in sitcom textbooks. Every moment was a sigh. Every glance was a prayer for reassignment. And John Schuck, who played Yo-Yo, gave the android a weird kind of sweetness. He wanted to be good at his job. He wanted to understand humans. He just could not quite get there. It was like watching a toddler in a trench coat trying to solve crimes. The humor was slapstick, no doubt about it. Doors slammed, phones exploded, Yo-Yo malfunctioned in the middle of interrogations. But underneath all the chaos, there was a real sense of warmth. Holmes never stopped being annoyed, but you could tell he started to care. And Yo-Yo, in his awkward, overly literal way, just wanted to be accepted. Not for his programming, but for who he was, or who he thought he could be. Of course, television in the 1970s was not exactly ready for a show this strange. It lasted just 13 episodes. Critics did not know what to make of it. Some called it goofy, others called it embarrassing, but a small group of people, those who watched with open minds and open hearts, got it. They saw the potential, the sweetness, the spark of something different. Looking back, Holmes and Yo-Yo feels like a glitch in the Matrix, a bizarre little experiment that came and went before anyone could really understand it. But maybe that is why it deserves a second look. Because underneath the pratfalls and robot jokes was a question that never really goes out of style. What does it mean to be human? And who gets to decide? It was silly. It was clunky. It was heartfelt in ways it probably did not mean to be. But more than anything else, it was unforgettable. You have to give credit where it is due. In 1975, ABC took a chance on a sitcom about a rundown hotel full of people society wanted to forget. The title card was missing the E in hotel, and that told you everything you needed to know. Hot L Baltimore was not about perfection. It was about people, complicated, messy, marginalized people, trying to find some kind of dignity in a world that had mostly moved on without them. The show was based on a play by Lanford Wilson, and if you knew the original, you probably blinked twice when you saw it show up in your primetime lineup. This was not your standard family sitcom. The characters included two prostitutes, a transgender woman, an elderly couple fighting eviction, a black militant, and a desk clerk who tried very hard to pretend everything was fine. It was loud, it was messy, it was real. There was no studio audience, no laugh track, just the quiet creaks of a decaying hotel and the strange, beautiful conversations that echoed through its halls. People were angry, people were scared, people were trying to make rent and remember their worth. And somehow, the show managed to turn that into half-hour episodes that left you thinking long after the credits rolled. This was not a show for folks looking to unwind with a light chuckle after dinner. This was for the people who had lived hard days and recognized that same tired look in the eyes of the characters. You did not have to agree with them, but you understood them, or at least the show made sure you tried. One of the boldest choices? It let people speak for themselves. The show never stepped in to explain or justify its characters. It did not say, "This is the good guy," or "This is the lesson." It just handed the mic to people you were not used to hearing from on network television and let them talk. And in 1975, that was revolutionary. It only ran for 13 episodes. The network got nervous, sponsors got nervous, viewers wrote letters. Some loved it, many did not. But even those who did not know what to make of it had to admit they had never seen anything like it. And maybe that was the point. Hot L Baltimore was not just a sitcom. It was a crack in the wall, a glimpse at the lives happening just out of sight. It was a reminder that even the forgotten corners of the world are full of voices that matter. And sometimes the weirdest shows are the ones that get the closest to the truth. You might not remember every episode, but you remember how it made you feel. And in the end, that is the kind of show that is too good to forget. If someone told you in the 1970s that they had a brand new sitcom and it was just like Gilligan's Island, only set in the Old West, you would probably laugh. And then they would tell you Bob Denver was in it, playing basically the same character, just with a cowboy hat instead of a sailor cap. And somehow, by the time the first episode ended, you would realize they were not kidding, and that it sort of worked. Dusty's Trail was unapologetically a copy-paste job. A wagon train gets separated from the rest of the group. Now you have 7 mismatched strangers lost somewhere in the frontier, trying to find their way back to civilization. You had the clueless leader, the snooty rich couple, the pretty school teacher, the shy girl next door, the smart one, and of course, Dusty. Sweet, simple, well-meaning, Dusty. Bob Denver leaned right back into what made him famous. He bumbled. He stumbled. He got the group into more trouble than they needed. But somehow, every time things fell apart, he found a way to help fix them, usually by accident. There was something comforting about it, something familiar, like reruns of your childhood playing out in a different costume. The Old West setting gave the show a different flavor. It was not just about getting off an island, it was about crossing deserts, avoiding bandits, dealing with broken wagon wheels and angry cattle. It played with Western tropes the same way Gilligan's Island played with pirate and jungle ones, and it had that same goofy charm. Wooden dialogue, stock sound effects, and the occasional anachronism thrown in just to keep you on your toes. Critics were not kind. They called it lazy, called it uninspired. But audiences? They found something else. A weird, offbeat comfort. It felt like flipping through the channels and landing on a show you forgot you liked. And before you knew it, you had watched 4 episodes and were halfway through a bowl of popcorn. Dusty's Trail only lasted 1 season, 26 episodes and out. But in those 26 episodes, it carved out a quiet little space in television history. It knew exactly what it was. It was not trying to win awards. It was not trying to break new ground. It just wanted to give you a smile and a soft chuckle at the end of a long day. And sometimes, that is enough. You do not always need irony or edge or a 7-layer story arc. Sometimes, you just need a well-meaning goofball in a cowboy vest, wandering the prairie with his oddball friends doing their best to get home. And if you watched it back then, even once, you remember. You remember the theme song. You remember the way Dusty said, "Oops." And you remember that sometimes the simplest things stick with you the longest. There is something about the early 1970s and strange marital sitcoms, shows that asked, what if your wife was not just your wife, but something a little more? That was the setup for The Girl with Something Extra, a show that imagined what would happen if the love of your life could also read your thoughts. Spoiler alert, it was just as awkward as it sounds. Sally Field starred as Sally Burton, a charming, clever newlywed with a secret. She had extrasensory perception. Not just vague feelings or hunches, actual full-on mind reading. Her husband John, played by John Davidson, found out about it right after their wedding. And from that point on, their domestic life turned into a never-ending guessing game. You would think a power like that would make things easier. It did not. Every thought John tried to keep to himself, she heard it. Every half-formed worry, every guilty craving, every impulsive judgment, Sally caught all of it. And no matter how much she tried to tune it out, it always came through loud and clear. The show had the pacing of a traditional sitcom, but the premise gave it a strange, almost futuristic edge. It was like Bewitched without the spells, or I Dream of Jeannie without the bottle. It leaned into the paranoia of marriage and wrapped it in a shiny comedic bow. How do you have an honest conversation with someone who already knows what you are about to say? That was the joke. That was the tension. And somehow it worked. Sally Field was already a known name by then, and her presence gave the show more credibility than it might have otherwise earned. She brought warmth, energy, and this perfect mixture of wide-eyed innocence and sharp timing. John Davidson played the increasingly frazzled husband like a man clinging to a sinking boat, trying not to think about how much he missed his ex-girlfriend or whether his tie made his neck look fat. The show touched on some real emotional truths, even as it played for laughs. The fear of being truly seen, the need for privacy, even in a marriage, the temptation to hide things, not out of cruelty, but because you want to keep something just for yourself, and the quiet, funny terror of realizing that no secret thought is ever really safe. It only lasted one season, just 22 episodes. The concept may have been too weird for primetime audiences, or maybe people just were not ready for a love story that came with telepathy. But those who watched it remember. Not because it was loud or flashy, but because it was different, and quietly honest in a way most shows were not. You might forget the plot of an episode, but you will remember the look on Sally's face when she accidentally heard something she should not have, or the moment when John tried to think about nothing and failed miserably. Because when a show reflects your deepest, most ridiculous fears, that is the kind of weird that is too good to forget. There is a very specific kind of sitcom that only existed in the 1970s, the kind where a group of overgrown kids, usually men, do not really have jobs, goals, or common sense, but they have each other. The San Pedro Beach Bums was that show. 5 guys, 1 boat, 0 direction, and somehow that was the charm. The setup was as thin as the plot lines. A bunch of young men, none particularly responsible, lived together on a houseboat in San Pedro, California. That was it. No high concept, no real stakes. Just pure, unfiltered 1970s mischief, usually with someone falling overboard or getting caught in a lie before the commercial break. The cast was a mix of personalities: the pretty one, the dumb one, the sensible one, the awkward one, and the enthusiastic one. You have seen that lineup before, and you will see it again. But the Beach Bums had something odd going for them. They actually seemed like friends. It was not just actors reading lines. It felt like 5 guys who had been stuck together long enough to actually care about one another, in the way only sitcom friends can. It was slapstick heavy, no doubt. People slipped on wet docks. Furniture got broken. There was always some hijink involving girls, jobs, or trying to scam their way out of rent. But it never felt mean. It was chaotic, but soft. You got the sense that nobody in this show would ever really get hurt or stay mad for more than 5 minutes. What made the San Pedro Beach Bums stand out, weirdly, was how low the ambition was. This was not a sitcom trying to say anything profound. It did not chase ratings by tackling hot-button issues. It was just 5 lovable dorks trying to live rent-free on a floating living room. And in an era of shows that were getting bigger, louder, and more political, there was something oddly refreshing about that. It was also very much a product of its time. The fashion, the slang, the music, all of it screams late 1970s California in a way that almost feels like parody today. But back then, it was just what life looked like if you were young, broke, and in no hurry to grow up. The show was created by William Blinn, who also worked on Starsky and Hutch, but you would never guess it from the tone. Where Starsky had grit, Beach Bums had flip-flops and water fights. And it was that shift, from high drama to low-stakes comedy, that made it both forgettable and kind of perfect. It aired just 10 episodes before being pulled off the schedule. Critics barely had time to write it up. Audiences did not have much time to fall in love with it. But the ones who did? They remember the lazy charm, the sun-soaked boat, and the friendships that felt just real enough. It was not groundbreaking, it was not polished, but the San Pedro Beach Bums was weird, warm, and somehow unforgettable. And if you ever caught it during its short run, you probably smiled more than you expected to. Sometimes a show is so strange, so completely baffling, that it stops being just a flop and becomes a legend. That is what happened with Turn On, a sketch comedy show that aired one single episode in 1969, right on the edge of a new decade. And then it vanished, canceled before the credits even finished rolling in some markets. Turn On was supposed to be the next big thing. It came from the same producers who gave the world Laugh-In, which had been a massive success. But while Laugh-In felt like controlled chaos, Turn On felt like someone broke a television in half and tried to tape it back together using punchlines and confusion. There was no host, no structure, no laugh track. Just a rapid-fire sequence of disconnected sketches that blasted across the screen like a television signal from another planet. Faces would appear. Jokes would be told, often about sex, race, or politics. And then they would disappear again, over and over. No context, no setup, just pure surreal rhythm. It was shot with extreme close-ups, harsh lighting, and almost no transition between bits. Viewers at home did not know when one sketch ended and another began. Some stations cut the feed mid-episode. Others received angry calls before the first commercial break. One ABC affiliate in Ohio reportedly called the network during the broadcast and said, "If that is a television show, then we are not a television station." The content was not even that offensive by today's standards. But the presentation? That was the problem. It was like watching a sitcom have a nervous breakdown in real time. And no one, not the audience, not the network, not even the cast, seemed ready for it. There is a strange beauty in that kind of failure. Turn On tried something bold. It wanted to reinvent comedy, make it punchier, edgier, faster. But it overshot the mark, by a lot. And in the process, it created one of the weirdest half hours in the history of television. And yet, buried under all the misfires and glitchy edits, there were flickers of brilliance. Some jokes landed, some sketches were ahead of their time. You could feel the potential in the chaos. It just needed another year, another format, another era. Something less buttoned up, something ready for weird. But television in 1969 was not that place. Not yet. And so, Turn On became a cautionary tale. One that producers whispered about for decades. "Do not go full Turn On," they would joke. Because it reminded everyone what could happen when innovation moves faster than comfort. Still, for those who saw it, live, raw, and utterly confusing, it stuck. You do not forget a show like that. You do not forget what it felt like to sit in your living room and ask, "What is this?" And maybe that is the real legacy. Turn On did not fail because it was weird. It failed because it was too weird, too soon. But that also made it unforgettable. You can almost hear the yelling before the show even starts. A gravelly, fast-talking voice tearing through whatever line was on the page, only to replace it with something even louder. That was C.P.O. Sharkey. And at the center of it all was Don Rickles, the insult comic of America, finally given a sitcom of his own. They barely tried to hide it. This was Rickles as Rickles, dressed up in navy whites, marching across a sitcom stage like it was a roast at sea. The premise was straightforward. Chief Petty Officer Otto Sharkey is in charge of a group of young Navy recruits. They are green, diverse, and constantly screwing things up. He is short-tempered, old school, and allergic to patience. So of course someone at NBC said, "Let's make them a family." And then they threw Rickles into the middle of it like a lit firecracker. It worked, sort of. The show leaned hard into tension. Sharkey would bark at every recruit, call them names you definitely could not use today, and somehow still find a way to make it feel like affection. His insults were rapid fire, merciless, but oddly inclusive. He insulted everyone equally, and that was part of the formula. Nobody was safe, but nobody was left out. The cast of characters made up the rest of the chaos. You had Daniels, the black recruit with a sharp wit of his own. Kowalski, the Polish goofball. Skolnick, the stereotypical nervous wreck. And each one got their moment to either challenge or confuse Sharkey. They were not exactly fully fleshed out characters, but they were solid punching bags and occasional scene stealers. What made C.P.O. Sharkey stand out, though, was not just the yelling, it was the timing, the rhythm. Rickles knew when to throw a jab and when to pull back just enough to let a line land. There were moments when the studio audience could not stop laughing, and other times you would swear the actors had no idea what Rickles was about to say, because often they didn't. You can feel it watching now. The scripts had structure, sure, but Rickles, he was a force of nature. He would go off script, ad-lib entire scenes, and dare the cast to keep up. You see their faces break, you see them pause, trying to reset, and you see Rickles absolutely loving it. It gave the show a live wire energy that most sitcoms did not have at the time. It felt just a little bit dangerous. But even beneath all the barking, C.P.O. Sharkey had moments of warmth. Sharkey cared about those recruits. He just had no idea how to show it. He would chew them out one minute, then fight for them the next. That push-pull gave the character depth, maybe not deep depth, but just enough to make you root for him, even when he was completely wrong. Still, not everyone loved it. Some critics said it was too mean, too loud, too stuck in the past. But for people who grew up on Rickles, this was a late career gem, a reminder that sometimes a performer is the show. Without him, the structure falls apart. With him, it lights up. C.P.O. Sharkey lasted 2 seasons, 37 episodes, and in that time, it carved out a strange little corner of sitcom history. One where military discipline met borscht belt comedy, and nothing ever went smoothly. But everything felt alive. And if you ever caught it, you probably remember more than just the shouting. You remember the rhythm, the edge, the way Rickles held court like a sailor turned stand-up who refused to let go of the mic. Because shows like that, they do not fade quietly. They leave a loud, funny echo and a grin you cannot quite explain. Every decade has its sitcom underdog, that one show that came and went before people had a chance to really understand it. In the 1970s, that show might have been Lots of Luck. A working-class comedy based on a British series, it starred Dom DeLuise at his most frantic and lovable. But the real secret? It was weirder and darker than people expected. The setup sounds familiar enough. Dom DeLuise plays Stanley Belmont, a bachelor who works in the lost and found department of a city bus company. He lives at home with his meddling mother, his sarcastic sister, and, most notably, his out-of-work brother-in-law, Arthur. A grown man who does nothing, pays for nothing, and sits around eating sandwiches like he is owed the world. Right away, the tone was different. Most American sitcoms of the time tried to paint the working class in soft colors. Hard days, but full hearts. Lots of Luck was not interested in soft. It was irritated, frustrated. It looked at blue-collar life and said, "This is exhausting," and then it laughed about it. Dom DeLuise was a hurricane. He sweated, shouted, pleaded, and collapsed, sometimes in the same scene. His energy was pure chaos, but it was grounded in something real. You believed Stanley was on the edge, trying to support a family that treated him like a walking ATM, dreaming of a better life while stepping over dirty socks and avoiding Arthur's snide remarks. And Arthur, oh Arthur, played to perfection by Warren Berlinger. He was lazy, smug, and absolutely impossible to move. He was the nightmare relative who never left. But also, he was funny. Frustratingly, hilariously funny. The show never gave him a moment of redemption, but it did let him win sometimes, and that made the comedy sharper. The mother, played by Kathleen Freeman, was the glue. She could cut through any argument with a single line. Fiercely loyal to Arthur, weirdly controlling of Stanley, and always ready to guilt-trip anyone in earshot. The show did not shy away from the dysfunction. It leaned into it. You could almost feel the walls of that tiny apartment closing in. And that was the point. What made Lots of Luck so strange, so unique, was its refusal to wrap things up with a bow. Most episodes ended where they began. No lessons, no change. Just another day in a house where love and resentment sat side by side at the kitchen table. It was sitcom realism, dressed in laughter and deli meat. There were moments that bordered on absurdism. Stanley would fantasize about escape, only to be dragged back to reality by a broken washing machine or a family emergency. And even in his dreams, he was not free. That tension between wanting out and never quite getting there gave the show an emotional weight under all the yelling. It did not last long. Just one season. 22 episodes. But it left a mark. People who grew up in cramped homes, people who had that one family member who refused to get a job. They saw themselves in it. You will not find Lots of Luck on many best-of lists. It is buried under bigger, shinier shows. But if you watched it, even once, you remember. You remember the yelling, the silence, the smell of cheap food in a hot apartment, and how even in all that mess it found something worth laughing at. Because sometimes the weirdest shows are not about big ideas. They are about small, stubborn lives, and those are too real and too good to forget. Mr. Smith was one of those shows where you had to pause and ask, did someone really greenlight this? The entire pitch could have fit on a cocktail napkin. What if a talking orangutan became a political advisor in Washington, D.C.? No, not a joke. That was the actual show. A real orangutan wearing a three-piece suit with the IQ of a genius and the attitude of a late-night comedian. And somehow, Mr. Smith was supposed to help fix American politics. You know, just casual chimpanzee policy reform. His name was not just for show. The orangutan, named Smith, could speak, not in grunts or gestures, but full sentences in fluent English. Thanks to a secret experimental serum, because of course there was a serum, he became super intelligent and was immediately roped into the government's inner circle. And if your brain is already screaming, wait, what? Good. That means you were alive during the 1980s and remember just how weird television got when no one was looking. Now imagine being a kid and turning on the television after school. You are expecting cartoons or slapstick comedy. But instead you get a dignified ape giving legal advice and weighing in on foreign policy. He did interviews, he held press conferences. He literally had a desk and an office, and somehow, no one in the show found this horrifying. The strangest part? The humans around him just kind of accepted it. They were mildly annoyed, occasionally confused, but not nearly as freaked out as you would expect. It was like Planet of the Apes had a baby with the West Wing, and no one stopped to ask if that made sense. And the jokes? Oh, they were strange. Mr. Smith would throw shade at senators, break the fourth wall, and sip coffee like he had just finished negotiating peace treaties. He was smarter than every adult in the room, and he knew it. Honestly, kids probably tuned in just to see what he would do next. Wear glasses? Type a memo? Roast a government official on national television? Every episode felt like someone's dream sequence that escaped into the real world. Of course, behind the scenes, it was not all smooth sailing. Working with a real orangutan meant every take was unpredictable, but that unpredictability only made the show more surreal. You never quite knew if you were watching a sitcom or a psychological experiment. And for kids who grew up in that weird window of television history, Mr. Smith left a mark. It reminded us that intelligence could come from anywhere, even a primate in a power tie. And maybe, just maybe, Washington needed a little more fur and a lot less ego. The Mystery Files of Shelby Woo was a quiet revolution. A teenage girl of color solving crimes on television without needing superpowers, a makeover, or a boy to save her. Shelby Woo worked hard, harder than anyone around her. She interned at the police department. She took notes. She asked the questions no one else did, and she always found the truth. She was not flashy, she was not loud, but she was brilliant, determined, sharp as a tack. And maybe that is why her show has been so forgotten, because it did not scream for attention. It earned it. Week after week, Shelby solved mysteries that were never too scary, never too simple, but always full of human details. A stolen trophy, a hidden letter, a secret someone would do anything to keep buried. And Shelby followed the trail not with gadgets or gimmicks, but with focus, with heart. She listened, she watched, she paid attention, and she always believed that the truth was worth the risk. The show did something rare. It gave us a girl who was allowed to be serious, not snarky, not quirky, just focused and full of fire. And it did not feel forced. It felt earned. Shelby Woo showed that being smart was not a flaw, that being curious was powerful, and that being different was not something to hide. It was something to build your life around. Watching her now, you realize how badly we still need stories like this. Girls solving problems, kids being taken seriously. Mysteries that matter, not because they are dangerous, but because they are real. Shelby never needed a cape. She just needed a notepad and the guts to keep asking questions. Amanda Bynes made us laugh when laughter felt simple. From All That to The Amanda Show, she carried an entire generation's sense of humor on her back. She was magnetic, quick, sharp, and brilliantly expressive. For every child of the late 90s and early 2000s, Amanda was not just a star. She was the moment. And then, one day, the smiles stopped coming. The world watched as Amanda's story began to shift. Headlines replaced punchlines. Her brilliance began unraveling in front of millions. Social media, paparazzi, cruel late-night jokes, it all became part of her unraveling. Mental health challenges took center stage, and the industry that once cheered for her now seemed to look away. But Amanda never gave up. She stepped out of the spotlight and into treatment. She focused on healing, on education, even enrolling in fashion school. She spoke about her struggles with painful honesty, never pretending things were easier than they were. It was raw, it was heartbreaking, and it was real. Today, she keeps a low profile, trying to rebuild something private and safe. The child who once lit up screens is now simply trying to find peace. And maybe that is the bravest role of all, not the comeback, but the quiet. Amanda Bynes may have vanished from our screens, but she never stopped mattering. There are certain shows that live in the very bones of American pop culture, and The Ed Sullivan Show is one of them. It ran for over 2 decades, from 1948 to 1971, and if you watched television on a Sunday night during those years, chances are Ed Sullivan was part of your weekly rhythm. It was a variety show, yes, but calling it just that feels too small. It was where America saw the Beatles for the first time. It was where Elvis Presley became dangerous, where ventriloquists, dancers, comedians, and opera singers somehow all fit under one spotlight. Ed Sullivan himself was famously stiff, famously awkward, and somehow perfect. He introduced the country to new talent with that signature delivery, and he made Sunday night feel like an event. There was a weight to every booking, like he knew it might shape the future. You did not just see stars, you watched them become immortal. Whether it was a shaky stand-up comic or a fresh-faced rock band, Sullivan gave them the biggest stage in America. And in doing so, he gave us permission to fall in love with something new. But time is cruel, and memory is selective. The black and white glow of The Ed Sullivan Show has dimmed over the years, especially for younger generations who grew up in color. They know the names, but not the feeling. They know the clips, but not the build-up. That moment when the whole family leaned in, waiting to see who Ed had lined up next. Now, the footage lives on in compilations and documentaries, and the stage he made legendary is mostly a footnote. But for a time, it was the heartbeat of America's living rooms. Then there was ALF, short for Alien Life Form. Yes, the show really named itself that. And yes, it somehow became one of the most beloved sitcoms of the late 1980s. Alf was a furry, sarcastic alien from the planet Melmac who crash-landed into a suburban family's garage and basically refused to leave. He looked like a cross between a teddy bear and a rug, had the voice of a Vegas lounge act, and spent half the show trying to eat the family cat. If that doesn't scream weird, I don't know what does. This was not your usual sitcom setup. The Tanners, an average American family, took ALF in without much hesitation. One day, no alien. The next, a wisecracking extraterrestrial is living in the laundry room and hogging the telephone. And the government? Nowhere to be found. The family had to hide him from the outside world, which led to all kinds of classic sitcom hijinks, but with a sci-fi twist. It was like E.T. if E.T. had a Brooklyn accent and a better stand-up routine. Alf was pure chaos. He would mess with the neighbors, destroy appliances, flirt with the mother, and deliver one-liners faster than you could finish your dinner. His humor was weirdly adult, full of sarcasm, dry wit, and bizarre cultural references. But kids still loved him. Maybe because he looked like something out of a toy aisle. Or maybe because he was the one character who never took anything seriously. He was rude, messy, and unapologetically loud. Everything you could never get away with at the dinner table. What made ALF stand out from the rest was its tone. It bounced between slapstick comedy and emotional depth with zero warning. One moment, Alf is dancing in the kitchen. The next, he's talking about the destruction of his home planet and the loss of his loved ones. For a show about a talking alien, it sure got heavy sometimes. And that hit 1980s kids differently. It gave you permission to laugh, but also to feel a little weird about why you were laughing. The set design and puppetry only made things stranger. Alf was a full-sized puppet operated by multiple people, and you could feel that tension. The show had to build trapdoors and raised platforms just to make it work. The puppeteer Paul Fusco also voiced ALF, and sometimes you could tell. The energy felt half scripted, half unhinged. But that was part of the magic. ALF didn't move like anything human, and that added a layer of eerie realism to an already bonkers premise. As the seasons went on, the show started getting darker. ALF's longing for home became more pronounced. The humor got weirder. The stakes felt higher. And when the series ended, with ALF captured by the government, it left a scar on every 1980s kid who ever believed aliens could be funny. The final note was not a laugh, but a question. What happens when your strange, fuzzy house guest gets taken away and never comes back? That was ALF in a nutshell. Part sitcom, part existential comedy, part alien fever dream that somehow felt totally normal on a Thursday night. The big comfy couch was more than just a place for Lunette to stretch into impossible clock shapes. It was a place that felt safe, soft, and a little bit magic. It is hard to explain to anyone who did not grow up with it. Why a clown on a couch could be comforting. Why a talking doll named Molly could feel like your best friend. But the show had a way of slowing down the world. You would turn it on, and suddenly everything felt like it was okay. Like there was time. Time to clean up the mess. Time to figure out your feelings. Time to be silly without being wrong. Lunette's voice was always gentle, even when she was mad. And those little stories she acted out with Molly on the floor, they hit different. They were not just make-believe. They were metaphors. Quiet little life lessons wrapped up in tea parties and feather dusters. The couch itself felt like a portal. Oversized, exaggerated, and a little surreal. But that was the point. The whole set felt like it belonged to someone who understood what it felt like to be small in a world that never slowed down. You watched for the laughs, the games, the naps on the couch, but you stayed because somewhere in the chaos there was love. Real, kind, patient love. The kind you maybe did not even notice until you missed it. The big comfy couch taught kids that messes could be cleaned up, feelings could be worked through, and everyone has a space where they are allowed to just be. And when Lunette looked into the camera, you really believed she saw you. Not a demographic, not a viewer. You. The kid who needed a break. The kid who needed a laugh. The kid who just wanted someone to sit beside them on the couch and say, "Let's figure it out together." Danny Lloyd gave one of the most iconic performances in horror history, before he even knew what horror was. As little Danny Torrance in The Shining, he whispered red rum into our nightmares and stared blankly into a future he could not escape. But off-camera, Danny Lloyd was not haunted. He was just a child with a quiet voice and a curious mind. And when the cameras stopped rolling, he did not chase the fame. He simply went home. He was only 6 years old when Stanley Kubrick cast him. Kubrick famously shielded him from the darker parts of the film, never letting him realize just how terrifying his role was. That protection became prophetic. Because after one more acting job, Danny Lloyd left Hollywood entirely. No talk shows, no press tours, no desperate clinging to a child role, just a vanishing act that felt almost supernatural. He became a biology professor, a husband, a father. He spent decades away from the limelight, content to live in a world where no one recognized his face, only his kindness. When he finally gave an interview years later, it was not to reclaim fame, but to reflect on how grateful he was for a normal life, one where he could grow up, finish school, and become someone beyond the boy who rode a tricycle through a haunted hotel. It is easy to forget that behind every iconic child role is a real child, and sometimes the best twist in a horror story is that the kid made it out, safe, happy, whole. Danny Lloyd disappeared, but not because he was lost, because he was found. The Chevy Mystery Show aired in the summer of 1960, when the days were long and television felt like a friend you checked in with every night before bed. At first glance, it might have seemed like just another crime drama anthology, but there was something darker lurking in its shadows. Hosted initially by Walter Slezak and then passed off to Vincent Price, yes, that Vincent Price, the show had a way of crawling under your skin. It did not just entertain, it unsettled. These were not tidy detective puzzles wrapped in polite endings. These were tales where justice did not always feel like justice, and good people did not always win. What people do not realize today is that this quiet little program on a quiet summer night introduced America to something that would eventually become a household name, Lieutenant Columbo. His first version appeared here, in the episode titled Enough Rope, long before Peter Falk's iconic performance. But the moment did not linger. The show vanished just as quickly as it arrived, as if it had only been passing through. It was the kind of show your parents vaguely remember, if they remember it at all. But its fingerprints are still all over the crime dramas we watch today, hidden, uncredited, and nearly forgotten. My Mother the Car is one of those sitcoms that even sounds made up when you say it out loud. The title tells you everything you need to know. A man discovers that his late mother has been reincarnated as a 1928 Porter automobile. Yes, a car that talks and nags and gives life advice through the radio. The moment you hear that, your brain kind of short-circuits. But in 1965, someone decided that was primetime material and the result was one of the strangest sitcoms to ever hit the airwaves. And yes, it haunted rerun blocks all through the 1980s. The main character, Dave Crabtree, buys the car, and it immediately starts talking to him, in his mom's voice. She says she was reincarnated through transmigration of the soul, whatever that means, and is now here to guide him through life. And by guide, we mean completely micromanage every decision he makes, including his career, his parenting, and his love life. So you had a fully grown man being parented by a classic car with a personality. And not just any personality, the kind that honks if you ignore her advice. It was part sitcom, part metaphysical meltdown, and somehow still managed to feel like a family show. Watching it was like attending a therapy session inside a used car lot. The car had headlights that blinked, doors that swung open dramatically, and a dashboard that somehow expressed disappointment. And even though Dave tried to keep this supernatural secret from his friends and family, he was constantly caught talking to his vehicle, at red lights, in parking lots, in the driveway. Imagine being a neighbor and watching that happen. You would be dialing the local psychiatric hotline before your morning coffee even finished brewing. But the weirdness did not stop there. The car had opinions on everything, and she was never afraid to share them. She meddled in her son's job interviews. She gave unwanted advice during dates. She even guilt-tripped him into doing chores. And the kicker? The car's voice, a refined maternal tone, came through the radio like it was your local AM station of eternal judgment. It was the sitcom equivalent of a hallucination with a laugh track. But somehow, it worked just enough to become a cult classic. Not because it made sense, it did not, but because it was so unapologetically strange. And it stuck around in reruns well into the 1980s, where a whole new generation of kids got exposed to the sheer madness of a man arguing with his car in broad daylight. Watching My Mother the Car as a kid felt like finding a glitch in the television matrix. It made you question how stories even got made. Who sat in a meeting and said, "Let us take grief, reincarnation, vintage vehicles, and put it all in a 30-minute comedy block." And more importantly, why did it kind of work? It left kids with a weird but oddly heartwarming idea. Maybe your mom is always with you, even if she now runs on gasoline. My Mother the Car was not about logic. It was about loyalty, family, and the strange comfort of knowing someone has your back, even if they are in the garage. The Busy World of Richard Scarry was one of those rare shows that made everyday life feel like an adventure. Not because it was flashy, but because it paid attention. Everything moved fast, but nothing felt rushed. The streets of Busy Town were filled with animals dressed like people, working jobs, making mistakes, saying sorry, and trying again. As a kid, that mattered more than you realized. You watched Hucklecat and Lowly Worm do everything from baking bread to learning how the post office worked. And it felt exciting, important. Like even the tiniest job had a story behind it. That was the genius of Richard Scarry. It turned the ordinary into something worth noticing. You were not just learning about the world, you were learning how to see it. To notice the mail truck, the grocery store clerk, the guy fixing the manhole. It told you that everyone mattered, even if they were just delivering apples. The animation was soft and playful, full of colors that felt like warm mornings in kindergarten. The music was cheerful but never annoying, and the characters made you feel like Busytown could be your town, just one step to the left behind your backyard fence. It was educational, sure, but never preachy. It explained the world without making it feel boring. And more than anything, it gave you the feeling that growing up might actually be kind of fun. Like there was a place for you in it, a job to do, a story to be part of. You did not just watch it, you lived in it for a few minutes at a time. And honestly, that was enough. Quinn Cummings was never the kind of child star who felt like a product. She was sharp, sincere, self-aware in a way that made her Oscar-nominated performance in The Goodbye Girl feel like more than just acting. It felt like truth. She was the clever kid who said what the adults were too afraid to. But even at her brightest, Quinn was already seeing through the glitter. She left acting before the industry could wear her down, before the roles dried up. before she became someone she did not recognize. Instead, she did something rare. She left on her own terms. Quinn became a writer, an entrepreneur, a commentator. Her essays cut like glass, funny, brutally honest, always thoughtful. She spoke openly about the absurdities of fame, parenting, and growing up in a world obsessed with image. Her exit was not a mystery. It was a declaration that her identity was not tied to box office numbers or red carpets, that she could be more. And she was. She built a second career from intellect and integrity, not nostalgia. In a culture that often devours its young, Quinn Cummings walked away with her voice intact. And maybe that is the most powerful kind of disappearance, the one that becomes a transformation. She is not gone. She is just somewhere better, somewhere real. Cop Rock may be one of the strangest experiments ever aired on network television. Premiering in 1990, it was an audacious fusion of gritty police drama and full-blown Broadway musical. Imagine officers discussing a brutal arrest and then breaking into a choreographed song about the criminal justice system. That was the show. It was created by Stephen Bocco, the mind behind acclaimed dramas like Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue. And maybe that was the problem. Audiences expected hard-hitting realism, not musical numbers performed in a courtroom. The shift was jarring. Each week, viewers were asked to suspend belief not just for a case, but for a genre. One minute, a detective was interrogating a suspect, and the next, a gospel choir was singing about corruption. It wasn't satire. It wasn't camp. It was earnest, and that confused people even more. The show wasn't trying to be funny. It was trying to be groundbreaking. The songs were sometimes moving, often bizarre, and always unexpected. Critics did not know what to make of it. Some called it brave. Others called it a disaster. Most just stared, baffled. Ratings tanked. After 11 episodes, it was gone. But in that brief, bewildering season, something bold happened. Cop Rock tried to do what no show had done before, or has done since. It blurred the lines between storytelling and spectacle, and it refused to apologize for it. Today, it's often mocked, sometimes defended, but rarely forgotten by those who saw it. It was television taking a huge swing, and sure, it missed. But it swung. And in a world of safe formulas and endless reboots, that matters. If you ever wanted a show that felt like someone dumped comic books, neon, and science experiments into a blender and hit maximum weird, then Misfits of Science was exactly that. This was not just a sitcom. It was a full-on, off-the-rails superhero show disguised as a comedy. And it wore its chaos proudly. You had a cast of characters with mutant powers, a government lab gone rogue, and enough 1980s synth music to short-circuit a Walkman. It was like someone tried to make a live-action cartoon using only spare parts from other genres. The show had the energy of a rock concert at a science fair, and the characters felt like your coolest weird friends from homeroom. It did not just break the mold, it tripped over it, zapped it with lightning, and made a joke about it. The team? Absolute misfits. There was a guy who could shoot lightning from his hands, another who could shrink down to the size of a soda can, and a telekinetic teen girl who constantly reminded you she was not here for your nonsense. And then there was the lead scientist, basically the human equivalent of a confused lab coat, trying to keep the whole group together. These were not polished heroes. These were weird, rebellious, emotionally chaotic outcasts. And that was the point. Every episode was a grab bag of madcap adventures. Government chases, exploding gadgets, mind control, time warps. It was all fair game. The tone shifted constantly. One minute you were watching a goofy car chase with banana peels, and the next, you were knee-deep in existential questions about identity and power. That is what made it so fascinating for kids. You could laugh at the goofy action, but still feel like you were watching something just a little bit dangerous, a little bit different, and it never really slowed down. The pacing was like a sugar rush, fast, frantic, and just on the edge of losing control. The visual effects were, well, they tried. Lots of glowing lights, off-screen sound effects, and actors squinting really hard to imply psychic strain. But honestly, that only added to the charm. You did not need it to look real. You just needed it to feel fun. And Misfits of Science delivered fun in wild, messy waves. What really set it apart, though, was the attitude. This was a show that knew it was weird. It leaned into the absurdity, laughed at itself, and gave 1980s kids something they had never seen before. A world where being strange was a strength, not a flaw. It said, you do not have to be a perfect superhero. You just have to be you. Weird powers, messy emotions, and all. And for a generation that grew up feeling like outsiders, that message landed hard. Even though it only lasted one season, Misfits of Science built a quiet legacy. It was the weird show you bragged about remembering, the one that made you feel like science could be chaotic, hilarious, and kind of awesome. And the best part? It made being a misfit look pretty heroic. If one of these weird gems sparked a memory, share it below. Tap like and subscribe for more forgotten favorites.